Some nights do not change your life immediately. They wait years before revealing what they have done. 5 years ago, I thought the snowstorm was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. My name is Olivia Harper, and back then I was 21 years old, exhausted, heartbroken, and trying to outrun a future that seemed determined to disappoint me. Chicago was buried beneath one of the worst winter storms of the decade. Wind howled between skyscrapers like a living thing. Snow covered the streets in thick white waves. Public transportation stopped running hours earlier, and every weather report warned people to stay indoors. Unfortunately, life does not always care about weather reports. I had just finished a late shift at a downtown restaurant when my phone buzzed with another message from my landlord. Rent was overdue. Again. My savings account contained less than $200. My old sedan refused to start. Everything felt like it was falling apart at the exact same time. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into the storm. Snowflakes stung my face. Visibility dropped with every block. The city lights became blurry halos floating behind a curtain of white. I remember thinking that if I could just make it to the nearest hotel lobby, I could wait until conditions improved. Instead, my foot slipped on an icy patch hidden beneath fresh snow. I stumbled hard and nearly fell into the street. Before I hit the ground, a hand caught my arm. Strong, steady, certain. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop moving. I looked up. The man standing beside me was taller than anyone I knew. Snow rested on the shoulders of his dark coat. His features were sharp, almost unreal beneath the glow of a nearby street lamp. Most of all, I noticed his eyes. Calm, focused, unusually intense. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was low and controlled. I nodded automatically, even though I was shaking from the cold. "Think so." He studied me for a second longer than most strangers would have. Then he glanced toward the darkening sky. "You should not be out here alone." Normally, I would have disagreed. Normally, I would have walked away. But nothing about that. Night felt normal. The storm worsened within minutes. Wind pushed snow across the streets in thick waves. Storefronts disappeared behind white curtains. The city seemed to vanish around us. When the nearest hotel announced it was completely full, frustration nearly brought tears to my eyes. I remember laughing bitterly at my own luck. The stranger remained surprisingly calm. "There is another place nearby," he said. "You can wait there until the road's clear." Every warning my mother ever taught me flashed through my mind. Do not trust strangers. Do not follow people you do not know. Yet standing in the middle of a blizzard with nowhere to go, I made a choice that would follow me for the rest of my life. I went with him. We walked several blocks through the storm until we reached a private building overlooking the river. Warm light glowed behind enormous windows. The lobby was quiet, elegant, almost empty. Everything about the place felt expensive. Everything about him felt mysterious. I never learned his last name that night. I never learned where he came from. I only knew that when he looked at me, it felt as though he recognized something I could not see myself. And as the storm continued to rage outside those windows, neither of us realized that fate had already begun writing a story neither of us would be able to escape. The sound of the storm followed me even after we stepped inside. I remember how quickly the world outside disappeared behind thick glass doors, as if the blizzard had been sealed away from another reality. The warmth of the building hit my skin instantly, making my frozen fingers sting as they thawed. The man who had brought me here spoke to the receptionist in a calm, controlled voice, as though this kind of night was completely ordinary. I stood beside him, still dripping snow onto the polished floor, suddenly aware of how out of place I must have looked. The lobby was quiet, almost unreal. Marble floors reflected soft golden light. No loud conversations. No chaos. Only silence and the faint sound of distant music from somewhere unseen. I should have asked for directions and left immediately. Instead, exhaustion won. He led me toward a private elevator without saying much. I noticed everything about him felt deliberate. The way he moved. The way he never seemed rushed. The way people around him subtly stepped aside as if they already knew his presence mattered. The elevator ride was silent. When the doors opened, I expected a simple office or waiting room. Instead, I found myself stepping into a space that looked more like a private suite overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Chicago buried beneath falling snow. Warm lighting softened the edges of the room. A single table held a glass of water and an untouched folder. "You can wait here until the storm passes," he said. His tone was calm but not distant. It was careful, like every word had been chosen in advance. I hesitated. "This is your place?" I asked. A slight pause followed before he answered. "Yes, just that. No explanation. No introduction. No name offered again." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how small I felt in a space like this. The silence between us grew heavier. Eventually I sat near the window. The storm outside had turned the city into a blurred painting of white and gold. Behind me, he remained standing for a while before finally speaking again. "You should eat something." I turned slightly. "I am fine." "That is not an answer," he replied calmly. A faint frustration slipped out of me despite myself. I did not exactly plan for dinner in the middle of a blizzard. For the first time, I thought I saw something close to amusement in his expression, but it disappeared quickly. He picked up a phone and made a short call. Within minutes, food arrived. Not fast food. Not convenience store snacks. Something warm and carefully prepared. I remember thinking it was absurd that someone could order dinner during a snowstorm as if the world outside did not exist. We did not talk much while I ate. I was too tired to question anything further. Eventually, I noticed a framed document on the desk behind him. It looked like a financial report or company profile, though I could not read the details from where I sat. I asked without thinking, "What do you do?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I manage companies." That was all. No name. No title. Nothing that made sense. The storm outside continued through the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep on the chair near the window. When I woke up, a blanket had been placed over my shoulders. The room was empty. The man was gone. No note. No explanation. Only the quiet city outside and the faint memory of a voice I could not stop thinking about. It would take me 5 years to understand who he really was, and even longer to understand why he never told me his name that night. When I woke up, the storm was gone. The city outside the window looked like it had been washed clean overnight, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire night. The warmth of the blanket around my shoulders was the only proof that it had been real. I sat up slowly, my head still heavy from exhaustion. The room was empty. No sign of the man. No sound of movement. Only the quiet hum of a distant city returning to its normal rhythm. I stood and walked toward the window. Snow still covered the streets below, but the storm had stopped. People were already outside again, moving through their routines as if the night before had not disrupted anything at all. On the table beside me, there was a glass of water and a small note. The handwriting was simple and precise. "You are safe now." Nothing more. No name. No signature. I held the note for a long time, trying to understand why someone would go out of their way to help a stranger, and then disappear without explanation. I left the building shortly after, guided by a staff member who treated me politely but offered no information about the man who had brought me there. Outside, the cold air felt different from the night before. Less violent. More ordinary. I walked home through streets that were already returning to life. Cars moved again. Stores opened. People laughed like nothing had changed. But something had changed for me. I just did not understand it yet. Days turned into weeks. I returned to my job. I paid rent late again. I tried to convince myself the night in the storm was nothing more than a strange memory caused by exhaustion and stress. Yet I kept thinking about his voice. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken by chaos. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me, as if he already knew something I did not. Sometimes I would pass by tall buildings downtown and find myself scanning faces in crowds without realizing why. I never saw him again. At least not then. 5 years passed slowly. Life did not become easier, but it became predictable. I learned how to survive uncertainty. I learned how to live without expecting help from anyone. I told myself the stranger was gone, and that whatever had happened that night belonged to a different version of my life. Then one afternoon everything changed again. I was standing in a small clinic hallway holding my 5-year-old son's hand. His name was Ethan. He had always been unusually quiet for his age, observant in a way that made adults uncomfortable without knowing why. The doctor had called us in for routine results, but something in his expression felt different this time. Serious in a way that made my stomach tighten. As we waited, Ethan suddenly turned his head toward the window. His small hand tightened around mine. I followed his gaze. Outside, the sky had begun to darken even though it was still early afternoon. Clouds moved quickly, covering the sun. A strange tension filled the air, subtle but undeniable. Ethan whispered something under his breath that I could not understand. His eyes did not leave the window. Then for a brief moment, I thought I saw something impossible reflected in his gaze. A stillness. A recognition. As if something deep inside him had reacted to something far away. I asked him what he saw. He did not answer. Instead, he pressed closer to me, as though listening to something I could not hear. That was the first time I felt it. The feeling that the past was not finished with me. That somewhere, somehow, the night I had tried to forget was still waiting to be understood. After that moment in the clinic, I could not stop thinking about the way Ethan had reacted to the sky. The doctor had assured me everything was normal, that children sometimes imagined patterns or responded strongly to changes in weather. But nothing about Ethan felt ordinary. He had always been too aware, too quiet, too focused on things other children ignored. That night at home, I watched him carefully as he played on the floor of our small apartment. He stacked blocks in perfect alignment, not rushing, not making mistakes, as if precision came naturally to him. When I asked him what he was thinking about, he simply said he was listening. Listening to what? I asked. He only tilted his head slightly and said, "The wind." I tried to laugh it off, but something about his seriousness stayed with me. Over the following weeks, strange patterns began to repeat. Ethan would pause suddenly in the middle of conversations and look toward windows as if something outside had caught his attention. On several nights, I woke up to find him standing near the bedroom window, completely still, watching the sky. There was never fear in his expression, only awareness, as if he recognized something I could not see. I started avoiding news reports, but one evening while working late, I caught a broadcast on a public screen outside a store. It showed an interview with a man I did not recognize at first. He was speaking about a rapidly growing corporation, one that had expanded across multiple industries in less than a decade. The camera focused on him for only a few seconds, but something about his presence made me stop walking. Calm posture, controlled expression, eyes that felt strangely familiar even from a distance. The caption below identified him as Nathaniel Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Industries. The name meant nothing to most people passing by, but for reasons I could not explain, my chest tightened. That night, I searched everything I could find about him. The information was scattered and carefully controlled. He avoided public appearances. There were almost no personal details. Some articles referred to him as a private investor who rarely engaged in interviews. Others described him as extremely influential in technology and energy sectors. Nothing in his public profile suggested anything unusual. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I had seen him before. Days later, Ethan asked me a question I was not prepared for. We were sitting together in the kitchen when he suddenly looked up from his drawing and asked if I remembered the man from the snow night. I froze. "What man?" I asked carefully. "The one who smelled like rain and metal," he said simply. My heart stopped for a moment. I had never told him about that night. Never mentioned any details. I asked him how he knew. Ethan only shrugged and went back to drawing, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. That night I could not sleep. I sat by the window for hours, staring at the city lights, trying to convince myself it was all coincidence. But deep down I knew something was shifting, something I could not yet understand. The world I had built over 5 years was beginning to fracture in small, invisible ways. And somewhere far beyond what I could see, the man from the storm was no longer just a memory. He was real. And he was getting closer. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself it was coincidence. Every explanation I reached for began to feel thinner than the last. If Ethan knew something about the man from the storm, then the distance I had built between that past and my present was already gone. I started paying attention to details I had ignored before. The way Ethan reacted to silence. The way he stared at reflections in windows. The way he sometimes paused mid-step as if listening to something just beyond hearing range. None of it felt normal anymore. One evening, I took him to a small park near our apartment. The air was cool, and the city was unusually quiet. Ethan ran ahead for a moment, then suddenly stopped near the edge of the playground. He turned his head toward the sky again just like he had at the clinic. This time there were no clouds, no storms, nothing unusual at all. Yet he stood completely still. "Ethan," I called gently. "What do you hear?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "A heartbeat that is not human." I froze. "That is not funny," I said carefully. He turned to me with complete seriousness. "I am not joking." I looked around the park. There were other children playing nearby. Parents talking. Ordinary. Sounds of an ordinary evening. But Ethan was focused on something none of us could perceive. That night I stayed awake again, sitting at the kitchen table while Ethan slept in the next room. I tried to make sense of everything logically. Stress. Imagination. Childhood sensitivity. Every rational explanation failed one after another. By morning I had made a decision. I needed answers from someone who understood more than I did. I searched again for Nathaniel Brooks, this time more carefully than before. Most public information remained vague, but I found something I had missed earlier. A recent expansion of his company had included investments in private research facilities located outside the city. One of them was only 40 minutes away from Chicago. The article mentioned nothing unusual, only advanced biotechnology research. But the timing felt too precise to ignore. Later that afternoon, while Ethan was at preschool, I took a train toward the facility. The building stood alone beyond the city limits, surrounded by quiet roads and controlled access points. It looked more like a high-security research center than a corporate office. I hesitated before approaching the entrance. Everything about the place felt intentional, protected, like information was meant to stay inside. Before I could decide whether to continue, a voice spoke behind me. "You should not be here alone." I turned slowly. Nathaniel Brooks stood several feet away, dressed in a dark coat, his presence as calm and controlled as I remembered from years ago. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He looked at me as if no time had passed at all. "Olivia," he said quietly. Hearing my name from him after 5 years felt like stepping into a memory I had buried too deeply to understand. "How do you know where I live?" I asked. His expression did not change. "I have always known where you were." The answer should have frightened me. Instead, it confirmed every suspicion I had been trying to avoid. Behind him, the facility doors opened silently, as if waiting for a decision I had not yet made. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer chasing the truth about my past. The truth had already found me again. I did not move for several seconds. Nathaniel Brooks stood only a few steps away, yet it felt like the air between us had become heavier than anything I had ever experienced. 5 years had passed since that night in the storm, and in all that time I had convinced myself he was nothing more than a memory shaped by exhaustion and fear. Now he was standing in front of me in broad daylight, as real and unshakable as the ground beneath my feet. "You followed me here," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. His expression did not change. I did not need to. That answer made something inside me tighten. Behind him, the entrance to the facility remained open, revealing a clean, silent corridor lit by soft white lighting. Everything about the place felt controlled, almost clinical, as if nothing inside it was ever meant to be questioned. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after 5 years?" Nathaniel finally looked away from me, toward the building behind him, as if choosing his words carefully. "'Cause something has changed," he said. My pulse quickened. "What kind of change?" He hesitated for the first time since I had known him, a rare moment where control slipped just slightly. "Your son," he said. The words hit harder than anything else he could have said. I stepped back instinctively. "How do you know about my son?" Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the quiet road behind me, then back at me again. "Because I have always known there would be a child," he said calmly. The world around me seemed to narrow. "That is not possible," I whispered. He took a slow step forward, but not in a threatening way. More like someone trying not to overwhelm something fragile. "Olivia, what you experienced that night was not an accident." I shook my head. "You are not making any sense." For the first time, something almost like frustration appeared in his eyes, but it was controlled, restrained. "I am trying to," he said quietly. The silence that followed felt endless. Cars passed in the distance. Wind moved through the trees along the road. Everything in the world continued as normal, except for the space between us. Then he spoke again. "Do you remember how you felt that night?" he asked. I did not answer. He continued anyway. "The cold did not affect you the same way it should have. Your heart rate stabilized when it should have been irregular. Your body responded differently. I felt my breath catch." "That is not possible," I said again, but weaker this time. Nathaniel looked at me directly. "It is because you were not alone." The implication of his words made my thoughts spiral. I thought about Ethan, about the way he reacted to things no one else could perceive, about the strange awareness in his silence. "What are you saying?" I asked carefully. Nathaniel turned slightly toward the facility again. "I am saying that what you think happened 5 years ago is only part of the truth." My hand started to tremble, though I was not cold. "You are telling me my son is connected to you," I said. His silence was answer enough. The realization did not come all at once. It came in pieces, each one heavier than the last. The storm, the stranger, the memory I could never fully explain, the child who listened to things no one else could hear, and the man who had always known where I was without ever being told. I stepped back again, needing distance to think. Nathaniel did not follow. Instead, he said something that stayed with me long after I left that place. I never stopped watching over what that night created, Olivia. And now, it is beginning to wake up. I left the facility without fully understanding how I managed to walk away. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back toward the city as if instinct alone was guiding me. Nathaniel Brooks had not followed me, but his words followed everywhere. 5 years ago was not an accident. You were not alone. It is beginning to wake up. Each sentence repeated in my mind like fragments of a story I had never agreed to be part of. By the time I reached home, the sky had already begun to darken again. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table drawing something in silence. When I stepped inside, he looked up immediately. His expression was too calm for a child his age. "Where were you?" he asked. I hesitated. "I went for a walk." He studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then returned to his drawing. Without another word. That silence frightened me more than questions would have. Later that night, I could not stop myself from searching everything I could about Nathaniel Brooks again. This time I went deeper. Not just public articles or corporate reports, but archive mentions, older records, and anything tied to his name before his company became well known. Most of it was heavily restricted or missing entirely, as if large portions of his history had been intentionally removed. I sat in front of my laptop for hours, scrolling through incomplete information until my eyes burned. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I found a reference buried inside an old research summary. The document mentioned experimental biological studies connected to human adaptation during extreme environmental conditions. The project name was partially redacted, but one phrase remained visible: Lunar Genetic Variance Response. I read it twice slowly. It made no sense in the context of corporate research. I closed the laptop and tried to convince myself I was imagining connections that did not exist. But then I heard something from the hallway. Ethan was standing outside his bedroom door. He was not asleep. I asked him why he was awake. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window at the end of the hall, the same way he had done before. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "The man from the snow is getting closer." My breath caught. "What did you say?" Ethan turned back to me. His eyes were calm, almost certain. "He is not far anymore." I felt my entire body go still. I asked him how he knew. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond normal sound. "Because I can hear him now," he said. The hallway suddenly felt colder, even though the temperature had not changed. I knelt down in front of him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" He reached out and placed his small hand against my chest. "Right here," he said quietly. "It is the same as mine." I did not move. I could not. Every rational thought I had tried to hold on to for 5 years began collapsing at once. Nathaniel's words. The storm. The memory I could not explain. And now my son standing in front of me, speaking as if he understood something no child should ever understand. That night, I stayed awake beside his door. I listened to every sound in the apartment, every distant noise outside, every shift of wind against the windows. And for the first time since the storm 5 years ago, I stopped wondering if I was being watched. Instead, I started wondering if something inside my own home had already begun to change. After that night, sleep never came easily again. I kept replaying Ethan's words over and over, searching for some normal explanation that would make them less frightening. Children imagine things. Children misunderstood feelings. That was what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew Ethan had not been imagining anything. The way he spoke, the way he paused as if listening to something distant, did not belong to childhood fantasy. It belonged to awareness I could not explain. The next morning I tried to act normal. I made breakfast. I packed Ethan's small lunch. I walked him to preschool like every other day. Yet everything felt different, like the world had shifted slightly off balance and I was the only one noticing. On my way home, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It was not the first time I had seen it, but this time it stayed longer than usual. When I looked directly at it, the windows were too dark to see inside. A quiet unease settled in my chest. That afternoon, I received a message I did not recognize. It contained no number, only a short line of text. "You are being observed." My hands went cold as I read it again and again. I tried calling the hospital, my workplace, even the landlord, thinking it might be some kind of mistake. No one knew anything about it. By evening, I picked Ethan up early. He did not ask questions, but he looked at me in a way that made me feel like he already understood something was wrong. That night, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to make my entire body tense. I opened it carefully. Nathaniel Brooks stood there, but this time he was not alone. 2 other men stood a few steps behind him, dressed in neutral clothing, their expressions unreadable. Nathaniel looked at me first. "We need to leave," he said calmly. My heart began to race. "Leave where?" "There is a secure location," he replied. "Somewhere Ethan cannot be reached by those who are watching him." I immediately stepped back. Watching him? Nathaniel's gaze did not shift. "There are groups that have been tracking unusual biological responses for years. Your son is now visible to them." The words did not make sense at first. I shook my head. "He is a child." Nathaniel's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "That is exactly why he is at risk." Behind him, one of the men placed something on the ground. A small device that emitted a faint light. It pulsed once, then stabilized. "A protective measure," Nathaniel said. "It will help reduce detection for a short time." I felt my world tightening again. "You cannot just come into my home and say things like this," I said. Nathaniel took a slow step forward, careful not to cross the threshold. "I am not here to force you. I am here because you already sensed something was wrong." My mind flashed back to Ethan's voice. "The man from the snow is getting closer. He is not far anymore." I looked toward the hallway where Ethan stood quietly, watching from behind the corner. He was not afraid. That scared me more than anything else. Nathaniel followed my gaze. "If you stay here, they will find him," he said quietly. The silence that followed felt endless. Outside, the city continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Cars passed. Lights flickered. People lived their normal lives. But inside my apartment, everything had already changed. And for the first time, I realized the storm from 5 years ago had never truly ended. It had only been waiting for us to notice it again. The moment Nathaniel finished speaking, the apartment felt smaller than it had ever been before. I stood between him and my son, unable to process the idea that everything I had built for 5 years could suddenly be connected to something I did not understand. Ethan remained in the hallway, calm in a way that felt unnatural for a child his age. He was not crying. He was not asking questions. He was simply watching Nathaniel as if recognizing him from somewhere deep inside his memory. I told myself to stay rational, to think clearly. But every rational thought was breaking apart under the weight of everything I had heard. "You cannot take him anywhere," I said firmly, though my voice shook more than I wanted it to. Nathaniel did not move closer. He only looked at Ethan for a long moment before answering. "I am not taking him away," he said. "I am preventing others from doing it first." The words sent a cold wave through me. Who are these people? I asked. He hesitated briefly. Organizations that study what they do not fully understand. My breath caught. That is not an answer. It is the only one I can give you right now, he replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Ethan slowly walked forward until he stood beside me. He reached for my hand without looking away from Nathaniel. His grip was steady. Too steady. I looked down at him, searching for fear, confusion, anything that would make sense. But there was only quiet certainty in his expression. He is not lying, Ethan said softly. My heart tightened. How do you know that? I asked him. He tilted his head slightly, the same way he always did when listening to something no one else could hear. Because I can feel it, he said. Nathaniel finally stepped inside the apartment, just enough to close the distance without forcing it. We do not have much time, he said quietly. The signal that reached him earlier was not random. It means his presence has been detected. I felt my stomach drop. Detected by what? Nathaniel looked at me directly. By something that should not exist in this world if everything were normal. My mind struggled to hold on to anything familiar. Nothing about this conversation belonged in the life I thought I was living. Ethan squeezed my hand tighter. I could feel his calmness spreading into me in a way I did not understand. It was not comfort. It was awareness. Slowly, I realized I had a choice I was not ready to make. Stay and risk whatever was coming for him. Or trust a man I barely understood to take us somewhere safe. Nathaniel did not pressure me. He simply waited. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware of what was unfolding in a small apartment on an ordinary street. I looked at Ethan again. He looked back at me and said the words I never expected to hear from him. I am not afraid, Mom. That was when I realized the decision was already being made, not by me, but by something far beyond what I could see. And when I finally nodded, Nathaniel gave a quiet signal to the others waiting outside, and the world I knew began to close behind us.